All right, so it should be going, and you know, this kind of what they did yesterday is just kind of moving it around, you know, so there's like sometimes those walk off, you know, apparently a walk around quite a bit. Anyway, guys, I wanted to say a few things
He's going to pick up the worst
up front about you know, how weird this week is, and just so that you can get the message. One is that I'm not going to be here on Sunday. It's Mother's Day. There's no way you're going to be here on Sunday. So what I'm doing is I'm going to stage the sitting of the final in this classroom and in adjoining classrooms on Saturday. I'll be here around noon. So that's the best I can do. Otherwise, we'll just have to shoehorn it in. Otherwise, the word from on high is that we're going to have a final exam. I think we all would like to take it before we go in and take the AP, so that we, you know, review. Just to remind you, there's the Mazzo essay that is, you can bring in the introductory paragraph and first body paragraph and quotes. That's kind of what we're doing right now, is kind of winding that thing up. It's what we've been doing for the last month and a half, basically, in this class, is looking at that, how to write that thing. It's a nice way to kind of pull things together in your own mind about post 45. I'll give you a choice of two. You'll write on one free response essay, or as I say, free association essay. Blue is this guy's. Anyway, no, but that's, you know, remember, Black Hawk Down, get in, get out, you know, kind of essay, and then multiple guess. And I'll probably just have you do the multiple guess first. You know, close your eyes, go random. Good things happen. Okay. And I'll do what do what you can to get here. Obviously, there's a lot of sports going on and things like that, so it's a crazy time of year. The other thing is I'm going to be doing these, taping the classes, just because, flat out most people can't be in class this week. I realize that there's going to be some people that flat out aren't going to be in class all week, so I've been doing this, and I'll have those up on the Moodle, linked into into the Moodle Center. There's this Yahoo, or not Yahoo, what's it? YouTube. Use guys, okay? So what we're going to be doing today and tomorrow, and what I'd like to ask you to do for tonight is to look on the Moodle page, and I have up there the Malaise of Democracy speech with Jimmy Carter, and then It's Morning Again in America. And I want you to compare the message and who would you vote for. Over here we have the Campaign 80 issues. Jimmy Carter, let's talk better mileage, and Ronald Reagan, kill the bastards. Who would you? Which message will resonate better with voters? I was alive in 1980 and actually quite aware of what was going on, and I can assure you that let's get better mileage wasn't really what people were concerned about. So Jimmy Carter is going to be, as we lost, he's going to lose. We're going to talk much more about Carter, the end of Carter, and going into Reagan tomorrow, or in our case, probably on Thursday, because we don't meet tomorrow because it's a B day. But for the other guys, we will. All right. So just so you know that that's kind of coming at you, and we're going to be doing that, and be looking on the Moodle page for these links to these videos, and watch them yourself, and then we'll come in and we'll talk about it, and hopefully I can find my statistics about kind of the cultural shift that's going on too, because that's very important for explaining the rise of Ronald Reagan as well. So, without any further ado, let's get into the foreign policy. And I just want to lay out kind of Reaganism, and then want you to think about this for tomorrow. Domestically, Ronald Reagan is going to be about a lot of things. One of them is rolling back a lot of liberalism as much as he can. And of course, the issue is obviously he wasn't able to roll it all back. But he's going to try to push back business regulations. He's going to try to weaken organized labor. He's going to do something about taxes. He's going to push back the welfare state. And I'm going to put in here, he's going to also introduce a level of cultural conservatism that really is getting back to something you would have seen before the 1960s. And understand, Ronald Reagan started off as a New Deal liberal, and people have, you can also YouTube this one. There's a great interchange between Sam Donaldson, who's rather feisty ABC correspondent, and Ronald Reagan, and Donaldson saying, Mr. President, you used to be a New Deal New Deal Democrat, why did you leave the party? Why did you abandon your party? And he's like, I didn't abandon the party abandoned me. And again, that gets back to kind of what we were talking about with Sam Yorty and George, kind of the appeal of Sam Yorty, George Wallace, and the like in the 60s, that cultural shift, the image of liberalism as being linked in the permissiveness and this real, people had a lot of distaste for this, at least in your white working class. So you're going to get this whole group of people out there who are called Reagan Democrats. And if I could find that YouTube video, if I could find that commercial, there's a great commercial from 1984. The father and son walking along, and the son's going, Dad, we always voted Democratic. And he says, well, son, there's a time, sometimes you just got to change. And the message being that, there's a group of Democratic voters out there who are moving over. So Reagan is going to do things like push back regulation. I remember the Environmental Protection Agency, there was a guy named James Watt. And it was very clever, my dad pointed this out, that you surround yourself with somebody like James Watt. The bumper stickers out west were dump Watt, they weren't dump Reagan. But Watt was just like, let's pull back environmental concerns. Let's privatize as much of the government as we can. Let's get rid of some of these onerous business regulations that are slowing things down. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? I mean, it's the same dialogue we're still having. With labor, and this is key. Ronald Reagan, I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie Pushing Tin. It's about air traffic controllers. Very, very nasty job. They were working on very antiquated equipment in 1980, 81. The union is PATCO, and PATCO actually supported Reagan. Organized labor supported, some parts of organized labor supported Ronald Reagan for president. PATCO supported him. They went on strike in September of 1981, and Reagan fired them all. Just said, you're done. So that kind of sent that struck a resonant note, with a lot of people saying that this guy, and incidentally, Scott Walker said that basically that was his, kind of guiding moment in history for what his interactions with the teachers' unions. He said, at that moment, Ronald Reagan sent a message to everybody that he meant business. And then that's what Walker was trying to, Walker was trying to do a lot of things, but he actually referred directly to firing PATCO. We didn't fire all the teachers. They're still working on that, but anyway, we'll get there. Okay, taxes, and we'll talk a lot about this tomorrow. He's going to roll back the tax rates at bigger. I mean, this is the first time he's done. This has been really done in a big way since the Kennedy tax cuts of the early '60s. Remember Walter Heller. But that was done for Keynesian reasons. This is done for supply-side reasons. And we'll talk about that supply-side revolution much more time.
$750 billion.
$750 billion tax cut, which got through a Democratic House. He didn't have control. Reagan never had control of both houses of Congress. And how they did that, we'll talk about more tomorrow. It's very interesting. If you read James Baker's memoirs, he was chief of staff, and he talked about how you had to go in and talk to conservative Democrats. And they cut a lot of deals, but they got it through. And somebody like David Stockman, who seems to be kind of upset about everything all the time, wrote a kind of kiss and tell article that you'll read for tomorrow on this supply-side revolution. And you're going to cut the welfare state. One of Ronald Reagan's largest themes was the welfare queen of Chicago. The idea that there was, people driving around in limousines, and getting out and buying 6 packs of beer and lobster with their food stamps. And that was one of his favorite stories. And so he said, we got to cut this back. We got to stop infantilizing people. Get them, it's undermining their character. Get them out there and get them working, and the only way to do that is to unleash business and cut the welfare state. Truman, I think, is what he said. Okay? And then there's going to be a healthy dollop of at least symbolic cultural conservatism. Reagan's going to call repeatedly for a constitutional amendment to ban abortion. And there's a lot of discussion about just, how easy is it to amend the Constitution? Well, and it didn't matter. He had his red meat constituency out there, and he was giving them lots to feed on. So, so I mean, I want you to just kind of keep in mind there's a lot going on at home. The other side of this is going to be a huge increase in military spending and a get tough attitude with the Russians, and in sharp contradistinction to Jimmy Carter, there's going to be a move away from this idea of human rights as being a part of foreign policy. I want to remind you that Carter himself had moved away from this. Carter, basically, if you want to look at the restart of the Cold War, it's really, it's a Carter-Reagan Cold War. Carter began to do this in 1978 and 79 with Soviet intransigence, mainly over SALT II, but also because of a lot of problems that were going on in, they call it, I can't remember what they call it, something like that, I want to say it's like the horn of crisis or something like that, the cone of silence. But, essentially, there's these areas in Africa that are still messes, places like Somalia that the Soviets were mucking around in, not to mention Central America and elsewhere, that the Soviets seem to be making a lot of noises. And I think, I don't know if you guys got a chance to read those chapters in Ambrose, but one of the things that Ambrose talks about is that Carter would make these gestures. We're going to stop supporting people who abuse human rights, and so we're going to let somebody like the Shah of Iran fall. And then later realizing that was a huge mistake. But the Soviets didn't take the bait. They used detente. And it's interesting that as much as Ambrose obviously does not like Ronald Reagan, and says actually some incorrect things in there. But the point is, he says that Reagan is correct in his analysis that you're fooling yourself if just doing unilateral things with the Soviets is actually going to encourage them to mimic that. In fact, they're going to take advantage of it. And so what Carter did, and just to remind you, is Carter basically raised the game in Western Europe. The Soviets had used the 1970s to put in what were called SS-20 missiles. These were short and medium range nuclear missiles. They call them theater nuclear weapons. And the launchers, and these theater, I almost think it's like the Nashville Channel or something, but no, these theater nuclear weapons. Of course, what's a theater versus a strategic weapon? Does anybody know? I think a theater weapon is one that's going to fall on you, and a strategic weapon is one that's going to fall on somebody else, from our perspective. Anyway, or maybe the other way around. But the point is that there's a lot of weapons aimed at turning Europe into a gigantic, the world's largest glass ashtray, basically. The Soviets raised the game by modernizing a lot of their missile force during the 70s. And so Carter actually began discussions for trying to force the Soviets to withdraw these SS-20s by saying we're going to put in Pershing II missiles, and there were ongoing negotiations from 1979 1983 looking at this issue. And of course the Europeans are less than thrilled by this. I mean, you can imagine in a place, it's like, okay, we're going to put in nuclear weapons, and in time of war, if some drunk drives across the Illinois border, we're going to have an exchange of nuclear weapons that are going to incinerate all of us. You can imagine how you feel about that. Well, that's essentially the Cold War scenario, nightmare scenario. Some drunk Russian would be driving through the Fulda Gap, and there was this hair trigger response. One of the guys I knew in grad school, his job during the 1980s was to literally drive a missile launcher into the forest, set the thing up, get it ready to shoot, and then he would get the message that, no, this is a drill. Up until the point he's ready to shoot the thing, he had no idea whether or not it was a drill or not. He just had to do it. And he did that, and he said he did that repeatedly, dozens of times throughout the 1980s. And so that's the kind of hair-trigger thing that was going on in Europe, and Carter's escalating this. The other thing that Carter's going to do is Carter's going to play the China card. He goes and fully recognizes the People's Republic of China. They sent Zbigniew Brzezinski. Remember Brzezinski from yesterday? Anybody here? You were here. Charper was here, okay? The big's the big. There's going to be a spelling test. Brzezinski. It's like Brzezinski or something like that. On the south side here, you have no problem spelling that, baby. But Brzezinski said, I'm the first Pole in 500 years to get back at the Russians. And when he went over to China, Deng Xiaoping had just come into power, and they were delighted by Brzezinski, because Brzezinski's like going, they climb up onto the Great Wall, and Brzezinski's taking his shoes off and saying, okay, I'll race you to the top of that hill. The last one up there has to fight the Russians in Mongolia. And the Chinese called him the polar bear killer, because he was just so adamantly anti-Russian. And so again, my friend Gene Garrison, who was now in Wyoming, was at BU with me, wrote this book about how advisors can really shape policy and reflect policy. And when Carter went from Cy Vance to the bigs of big, it's really an indication that things were getting hot again. And Carter was boosting defense spending. So, I mean, you already had this momentum going. The Cold War's back in force. Containment's the order of the day. Only the stakes are so much higher. And again, you can read in Ambrose and look at the numbers of warheads out there. Remember we talked about MIRVs yesterday? Multiple independently programmable reentry vehicles. And basically you're putting dozens of warheads on one launcher, and they can hit multiple targets. So a single Trident sub could take out like 80 Russian cities and things like that. At least those are the statistics that floated around. And so Reagan's going to come in, and remember we talked about this yesterday, that there was this idea that there's this window of vulnerability out there. The Soviets had used détente as a ruse, and remember we pointed it out in the sky? Remember that? Okay? Nishad remembers that, okay? And we saw it, and again, it's a clear day. No, this closed. All right, you missed it. Anyway, but there's this window of vulnerability out there, and there was a lot of domestic critics, like Paul Nitze, of NSC 68 fame. He's still around, he's still fighting with George Kennan. They see each other at dinner parties, and they start pushing each other, and they have to be separated. I'm kidding. No. But, I mean, I just want to throw out a call for reading the John Lewis Gaddis biography of George Kennan. When you get the gumption, I'm sure Hiller's got it on his top list. It's only about 850 pages long, but it's a really, really good biography. But one of the things that really separates Kennan from Nitze is that Nitze was looking at these numbers, and then what the Soviets were building. Backfired bombers, SS-20s, new generations of ICBMs, MIRV missiles. All this stuff that they're putting into place. And what he saw was intentionality. Capability meant intentionality. They must mean to use this stuff. Kennan, who is looking more at psychological factors, historical factors, and is probably the top Russian expert in the United States through much of the 20th century, said, no, what you've got is a bunch of nervous, graying, dying old men in the Kremlin who are afraid that their experiment is going to fail and are getting basically buried economically by the United States. Remember, we talked about the Soviet economy being held together with lies and alcoholism, and that's basically the nicest thing you can say about it in the 1970s and 80s. Just a good place to die young. I think mortality rates, your life expectancy is, in the 60s or something like that. They drink their favorite game of the Russians was Napoi, which I guess was just downing, tumblers of vodka till you just passed out. That was their idea. I know. I hope there's no Russians here, so I apologize. But the thing is it's a grim place under communism. And so that being said, Ronald Reagan comes in, and Reagan, another great Reagan video you can get is the campaign ad. There's a bear in the woods. Definitely YouTube. There's a bear in the woods. You've got to see this thing. It's just fabulous. Anyway. But Reagan is able to parlay this and say, look, if the Soviets are out there, they're evil, they're aggressive, and we're not going to put up with it anymore. So he pushes for a defense spending of $1.6 trillion over a 5-year period. That's rising from détente era levels of $40 to $50 billion. Again, this is 1980s dollars, so this is a considerable amount. Defense spending goes up to around 6%. Remember, NSC 68 was about 15%. part of the calculations is they said we wanted to be able to fight 3.5 Vietnam wars simultaneously. So you needed a lot of conventional forces. You had to have a 500 ship navy. 500 ships to win a battle of the Atlantic, to make sure if the Soviets moved, you wanted to be able to take them on in Europe and beat them. Now, of course, this is all begging the question, because if the Soviets moved, our major strategy was to start using nuclear weapons. But who's going to quibble with the Gipper? And lastly, you're going to close this window of vulnerability, and so they're going to do a couple of things, and these are fun. The MX missile, I never could name the thing. MX missile. Revive the B-1 bomber. The B-2 bomber was a Democratic bomber. The B-1 bomber is a Republican bomber. Give you an idea of how this. Are you, Waples, you okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Reading something.
Okay, yeah, it's hard to read my handwriting. I apologize. Because then I got needs in there. All right. So, the B-1. Just to give you an idea of the partisan politics, the B-1 bomber reputedly was built in all 50 states. Parts of it were built in all 50 states. Why would you do that? Anybody know politics? You know politics, however.
Because they probably gave a cut to each senator to get to build them in his district.
Yeah. Right? You guys get that? They say, hey, these are jobs. I bet you a little manufacturer. I mean, it did the same thing. The British were like, we didn't want it. They didn't want to see new generations of weapons and Great Britain, and next thing you know, Reagan sends over George Shultz, and George Shultz is saying, by the way, we're going to be raising, this could mean $300 to $500 million a year in outlays for supplies and stuff, and suddenly Margaret Thatcher was much more amenable to the idea. The point is, though, is the B-1 bomber is going to come back, and you're going to build this thing, new generation. We still were using B-52s. Okay? The MX missile was going to be a new generation of MIRV launchers. And you were going to put those Pershing II missiles into Europe. And the height of Reagan buildup came in 1983 when he announced that we were going to build a anti-ballistic missile system, ABM, called the Strategic Defense Initiative that people dubbed Star Wars. Okay? So this is a huge ramp up. Just to give you some of the ideas that they had for the MX missile. Remember, you had the window of vulnerability, and the window of vulnerability was the idea that in the event of a war, the Soviets could launch a preemptive first strike, and because they had basically modernized their forces, that they would be able to hit us before we could retaliate and ultimately take out enough of our weaponry we wouldn't have an adequate retaliatory strike to inflict casualties that would be unacceptable to the Soviet Union, undermining mutually assured destruction, undermining that. And this was the problem at Dayton. Okay, you guys saw the window of vulnerability out there. Okay, and so what Reagan said is what we need to do, and this is the idea, is we wanted to set up kind of what they call a shell game. And I know this because I grew up out west. This is a big discussion out in Montana, because what they wanted to do is they wanted to put, ICBMs, these MX missiles, on railroad cars and shuttle them throughout the West, along with a bunch of dummy targets as well, that would cause the Soviets to have to expend so much of many of their missiles to take this out that it would nullify their advantage, their numerical advantage, and close that window of vulnerability. Well, can anybody think of a problem with that if you're putting ICBMs on railroad cars and shuttling them throughout the American West?
What if one explodes?
The train breaks down, or a train gets in a wreck. What else?
It's not as well protected.
Okay. It's out there in the ocean. Well, what do you think the people who live out west said about this? It's kind of funny.
Well, they probably feel threatened because the Soviets will just bomb the whole West to find the train.
Yeah. And you've got these things going through your backyard. Oh, look, there go the MX missiles, no wave, and some of the people who stopped it were people like Warren Hatch, who just said, it was a very staunch conservative Republican that said, we're not going to have a bunch of weapons being shuttled through my state. We know where they're at. If they're in the ground, we can deal with that psychologically, but we can't deal with the idea that these things, for all the reasons you guys put out there. So the MX missile was ultimately put into hardened silos, and this is great, the terminology here, in these hardened silos in what they call dense pack. And the dense pack was, they're so close together that the Soviet missiles would engage in what was called fratricide. And the fratricide would be, the missiles would hit each other on the way down because of the dense pack. And I remember my brother-in-law, wasn't my brother-in-law at the time, he used to draw cartoons for the Daily Cardinal, and he drew a picture of the Reagan administration standing together, this in a dense pack. But it was just the idea that, basically they did what they did with any other missiles, so they just put them, out there. But they had all this wonderful terminology, the dense pack and things. So the MX missile really wasn't a huge game changer, but it was, again, a significant rise. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that we never did, during the Reagan administration, I think it was very late in the game that we actually hit the limits that were put in place by the SALT II, even though we didn't sign the SALT II and never ratified it, because we were just modernizing our forces along the way and becoming much more, having much more effective nuclear forces, while, adhering to these limitations. And so the United States was, again, really raising the game and scaring a lot of people. And particularly, can anybody think about why the SDI, the Star Wars, would be so disruptive to this system? Remember, the SALT I treaty had actually prohibited an anti-ballistic missile system. Why would Star Wars be something that was scary?
And it doesn't matter how many weapons the other side builds, if you can just stop them.
Yeah, okay. But what is it going to encourage the other side to do, maybe? If you know that you've got an anti-ballistic missile shield up in space that can stop incoming missiles, what might they start doing?
Making missiles that are resistant to that shield or make their own shield themselves.
Okay. And then, of course, we would have to get around their shield, which would mean you'd have this spiraling arms race. Don't get me wrong. Ronald Reagan wanted to get rid of nuclear weapons. That was his major idea. He wanted to make the United States safe from nuclear attack. And he saw MAD as whacked out. This is not the way to do it. However, his policies tended to fall into that. Now, we'll talk about how he moves over to the other side and is able to stop this a little bit. But what Reagan did was he did this massive escalation, and this, of course, is throwing out into question all of the earlier arms control negotiations. So you've got then all of this, you've got this huge conventional push. You've got nuclear weapons being put in, and new generations of them, including an anti-ballistic missile. And you begin to push away that human rights focus of the Carter administration. Remember, Carter had said we're going to actually look at human rights, which meant, of course, that he's going to be judging our allies, many of them around the world. Remember the Nixon doctrine, we were going to bolster regional proxies to carry out our mission in places like the Persian Gulf. We would give a lot of money to the Iranians, a lot of help, a lot of weaponry. We would help the Republic of South Vietnam stabilize itself. That didn't work out so well. Neither didn't work out so well in Iran either. But what Carter eventually did was he began to alienate and allow a lot of these dictators whom we had supported during the Cold War to fall away. Reagan's going to say we're not going to do that anymore. And it's our representative in the UN, a woman named Jean Kirkpatrick, made a distinction between an authoritarian and a totalitarian regime. Authoritarian regimes respected property rights. Totalitarian regimes didn't. So therefore, if you respect property rights, you have a semblance of civil society, and you can start building, and eventually you'll get some kind of more democratically arranged government. A lot of people thought that was a pretty fatuous distinction, but it was one they made. Again, it's something we can talk, we still talk about. And so what this meant, of course, was that, the United States was going to be more than happy to find right-wing dictators who had support of the moneyed classes in their societies who might have, horrible human rights abuses, but we're going to support them. And and we're going to oppose countries that come in and say do things like land reform. So the biggest example of that is Central America. We'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. But I want to just lay out a little bit of what Ambrose talks about here. By the way, did anybody get a chance to read that 15th chapter in Ambrose? It's a long one. Yeah.
I read most of it.
Yeah. So what did he have to say about places like Lebanon and Grenada and Nicaragua and stuff? I mean, what's his overall tone?
In the Reagan?
Yeah.
Reagan, I mean, it was just basically like another proxy. I like to bring it back to like yesterday when we were talking about proxies yesterday. It's just another plan to fight the USSR.
That a lot of people were worried that they were just going to turn into more Vietnam Wars, where you get involved and spend tons of money, and what's America getting out of it. So.
Okay. And I'm just going to put this word up there. Vietnam syndrome. Is there any on there? I'll put one in. Okay. Just see whether it is. But yeah, there's a Vietnam syndrome. There's a lot of people who are saying we can't go out there and get ourselves into a place like Central America or Lebanon for that matter, because it's a quagmire. It'll suck us in. And it really wasn't until the 1990s and even the first Gulf War there was a lot of concern. I mean, George Bush Sr. did not go to Baghdad. It's really not until 2003 that Bush went on. Bush Jr. went in, and we got ourselves ensconced in a real land war where we went in and toppled a dictator and things like that. And the idea is that what happens is you get mission creep, you have no exit strategy, and you're going to end up getting pulled in, very much like the Soviets were getting pulled into Afghanistan at that very same time, and it's just going to be this huge wasteful endeavor. Interestingly, despite what Ambrose says, is Reagan never did get us involved permanently in these places. When things got nasty, he got the guys out. Albeit after with a place like Lebanon, did you guys read about what happened to our Marines in Lebanon? Did you pick that up? There was a suicide bomber, and 240 of them were blown up in late 1983, and the United States pulled the troops out very soon after that, and Reagan got them out. And the Grenada is an island in the Caribbean. Basically 40 drunk Montanans with baseball bats could have taken that place. And then Nicaragua is done through proxies, namely these Contras. But it's interesting that the guy who had the harshest rhetoric, really, if you look at where it's almost reminds me of Eisenhower, he's very, very circumspect about committing American troops. He does it, but it's not it's not something like what you saw with the kind of verve that Kennedy and Johnson carried out, which again gives you that idea of the faith of the liberals in being able to remake things. So just so you know that these things are out there, Lebanon's a big mess. Guess what? It's a big mess again. For those of you who've been watching the news about the Israelis taking out targets in Syria, mostly aimed at a worry of a transfer of armaments from Syria to Hezbollah in Lebanon, very similar to the transfer of weapons that went on when Libya fell to Al-Qaeda in places like Mali, right? I was watching that and I was going, Henry must be all over this stuff, okay? So I mean, there's still, it's interesting to see these hot spots. Whereas Central America is pretty, together right now, as far as I can tell. Maybe I'm wrong. Okay. But the big issue here I want to talk about today, we've got 10 minutes, and I think we've got to get Reagan his due on this stuff, is the arms control that he carries through. And the first term is not pretty. This is when I was convinced I was going to die in a nuclear war, and so you might as well just have fun, right? And So what Reagan said is he wanted to see a zero option for all arms control in Europe. He said we need to just basically get rid of entire classes of weaponry. The Soviets didn't like this because they had an actual superiority at that time. They also were very resistant to the kind of verification that would have to go in there. And of course, the United States was on that track to put in Pershing II missiles. And when nothing came of this in 1983, the United States put the Pershing IIs in. 1983, you have Star Wars, but you also had the KAL 007, I'm not making that up, airliner, which was a Korean airliner that was shot down straight into Soviet airspace, and they shot it down. And it killed a lot of people. And so if you ever fly to China, and you go from Chicago to Beijing, you get into Soviet airspace, right? You're going over to like Kamchatka and stuff like that. And if that happened in the Cold War, they would have shot you down. You'd be dead. So it's wondrous world we live in. Reagan then dubbed the Soviet Union an evil empire. He said, "This is just this regime is evil. No ifs, ands, and buts." Notice how different that is from Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon said, the Soviet Union is just like any other great power. Him and Kissinger say they've got their interests, and basically you've just got to find mutual interests, and you can actually negotiate with these people rationally. Reagan's like, it's really getting back to almost that early Cold War language, where we know that these are inalterable foes, and we can't deal with them. Well, a couple of fortuitous things happened for Ronald Reagan and for the world. Got to put this out there. One was that Al Haig made the mistake. Ronald Reagan was shot. Do you guys know that? That somebody tried to assassinate Ronald Reagan and plugged him with I don't know how many bullets outside that Hilton. You can go to above DuPont Circle. There's the Hinckley Hilton. A guy named John Hinckley had a thing for Jodie Foster. Very weird. Shot Ronald Reagan, and if he'd had a bigger caliber weapon, Ronald Reagan would have been dead. Ronald Reagan wasn't dead. He survived, actually, became much more popular at that moment. But the thing is when he went down, his Secretary of State, Al Haig, said, "I'm in charge." And that didn't fly well with the Vice President, and didn't fly well with Ronald Reagan. So they fired Haig, and they brought in George Shultz. And George Shultz is kind of this, in and outer foreign policy, kind of goes to Bechtel and internationally oriented firms, and then back in the highest levels of business. I think he'd been Secretary of Treasury for Nixon. Well, Shultz is brought in Secretary of State, and if you read Shultz's memoirs, it's a really interesting thing that happens in I think it's 84. There's no negotiations going on with the Soviets at this time. The deepest Cold War. And there's this huge snowstorm that happens. It means the Schultzes and the Reagans are both in town, and Reagan invites Shultz over to dinner. And Shultz and Reagan sit down, and Shultz says, Mr. President, it looks like you're going to cruise to victory. I mean, nobody was going to beat Ronald Reagan in 1984. And especially not Fritz Mondale. And what Reagan said, and he said, "Sir, I think we need to start some talks with the Russians. I think, and Reagan agreed. He said, we've gotten to this position of strength, and I feel that we can actually start talking to them, and things might happen." Ronald Reagan, the way his inner circle worked was if you got to him and you were the last one to talk to him, he tended to listen to you, and then he would go for that. Well, George Shultz got to him. No one else was around to say no, because Dick Cheney or all the rest of these guys weren't around to say, "Hey, Mr. President, don't sell the farm." So Shultz was able to get Reagan to agree to at least think about this. Now, the other thing that added to this was a command and control exercise in NATO called Able Archer. And this is truly frightening, guys. It came out, there was a double agent in the Kremlin, maybe a single agent, I don't know what they're called, but he essentially was a plant by NATO who was giving us intelligence at the highest level. And he said that during this command and control issue, in other words, this is like a full war game with all of the commanders of NATO involved. So Thatcher was involved, Reagan was involved. The various heads of state. And what they did is they literally flew, jets at the border, mobilized as if the war was starting. The Soviets took it seriously and began and sent interceptors at the border and began counter-mobilizing and went to their highest level of security and were waiting for the war to begin and were preparing, believing that Reagan would start a war preemptively. And when Ronald Reagan heard of this, it shook him to the core. At least, all indications from memoirs and, first-hand accounts, that he couldn't believe that someone would believe that he would start a war because he was so inalterably opposed to nuclear war. He was trying his best to, avoid it. He believed he had to be strong. So at that point, Ronald Reagan, and this is starting in 1984, and really beginning into 1985, began to seriously think about how ways in which they could get the Soviets to come to an agreement to start de-escalating and start cutting weapons systems. He didn't want limitation anymore. He wanted to reduce the number of weapons and make it safer. He was helped mightily in 1985 by the end of the Stalin era, what they used to call it gerontocracy, right? Geriatrics, right? And then gerontocracy is a rule of geriatrics. You guys know what a geriatric is? A geriatric word? Old people, like me. Right? I got my AARP card now. It's great. I sit down and my wife comes up and just like, leave me alone. Okay? Anyway, so Gorbachev is going to come in, and Gorbachev is going to be part of a new generation of Soviet leaders who aren't Stalinists. He didn't grow up under Stalin. Brezhnev had. And he was going to be, and don't get me wrong, Gorbachev's a communist. He believes that communism can work. But on the other hand, he thinks that something's got to give because the economy and the society is just not delivering the goods and it's creaking along. So think about this confluence of issues. Ronald Reagan starts listening to George Shultz. Ronald Reagan has achieved massive arms buildup, peacetime arms buildup. He's able to, he's gotten frightening reports that he's beginning to frighten the rest of the world, which he doesn't like. And he's actually got somebody he might be able to start talking to. And of course, the person who's going to be really a key person in all of this is going to be Margaret Thatcher. And I'm actually looking forward to reading the biography. I'm sure it'll annoy the hell out of me, but there's a new biography out, official biography of Margaret Thatcher. The first volume of which is coming out this summer. So, guys, kind of like Harry Potter, get in line at midnight. The new Thatcher biography. I'm sure you'll read it. But Thatcher met with Gorbachev and told Reagan, this is a communist we can deal with. We can do business with this guy. I just want to end with a few things about what Gorbachev is looking at, and then get into these summits. We'll begin this tomorrow, okay? But basically, Gorbachev and his sidekick, Eduard Shevardnadze, and Shevardnadze is from Georgia, right? He played for the Bulldogs? No, he didn't. It's Georgian, kind of, isn't it? Like, near Azerbaijan and stuff like that. You know geography. I don't. Okay. But Gorbachev and Shevardnadze are going to come in, and they're going to say, look, we got to do 4 things. We need to, what they call democratization, that means competition for party posts. You're still going to have a single-party dictatorship, the proletariat, but it's so corrupt you need to start bringing in fresh blood. To do this, you need to have openness. Somebody actually has to start telling the truth. And when you actually start loosening up the party control of the country and you begin to have an open dialogue about what's going on, you can restructure the economy so it begins delivering the goods for your people. Perestroika. And the only way you're going to be able to afford to do this is through new thinking in foreign policy, which includes de-escalating the Cold War. So what we'll do tomorrow is, I guess we'll finish up I'll just read off the summits and you can think about it. Geneva and Reykjavik in 85 and 86, those were where they met and actually realized they could do business with one another. And this is derailed by Star Wars. By 87, Gorbachev said, well, we just got to do something. So in 87, they actually had the INF, which is your Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, where you actually got rid of entire classes of nuclear weapons for the first time in the Cold War. It included trust but verify. Reagan's, I can't say that in Russian. We'll have to ask Mrs. Yeager how to say that. But that is verification issue in here. And this is the beginning of the end of this Cold War. By 1988, Gorbachev announced that he was going to pull the Soviet troops out of Afghanistan and announced what they called the Sinatra Doctrine in Eastern Europe. And they asked him about that, what does that mean? He said, well, you've heard, the old Sinatra song, I'll do it my way. Well, they can do it their way. Firmly believing that people, if given the choice, would choose communism. Guess what? They were wrong. All right, but they were right on this. So Reagan is going to get a remarkable sea change in this. You might want to Google some of the video from his trip to Red Square in 1988, where he is asked point blank, is this still the evil empire? He said, no, those were different times. Those were different people. Things have changed. And the hallmark of Reagan's greatness is that he was able to see the changes and adjust his policy accordingly. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. Thank you.